Welcome back. As U.S. President Donald Trump has been accused of many things, and here comes a new accusation: diplomatic vandalism. That's how Britain's ambassador to Washington reportedly described Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal in May of 2018. According to diplomatic cables leaked to British media, Sir Kim Darroch said Trump's, quote, diplomatic vandalism was done to spite his predecessor, President Barack Obama. So, how many other U.S. foreign policies may be driven by Trump's desire to unravel Obama's legacy? And to what degree, if any, could that resentment be fueling Mr. Trump's confrontational approach toward China? Joining our discussion from Washington, Professor Iain Begg of the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Richard Weitz, a security expert at Wikistrat Global Consultancy. And right here in Beijing, we've got Professor Jishe, a senior fellow of the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So welcome all. This internal diplomatic cable was published by the Mail on Sunday during the weekend. This is, of course, the second leak. The first described the administration as inept and called the White House as uniquely dysfunctional. Richard, over to you first. Give us your sense as to how these initial cables leaked. And look, a foreign adversary as the source of leaks have been ruled out right now. So who might be behind this leak, and what is the motivation behind it, you think?
Right. We don't know. But you could speculate that the person either wanted to deepen antagonism between the U.S. and Britain in general, or wanted to create difficulties for the conservative government, or perhaps it was a personal vendetta against the ambassador, and this was a way to sabotage him and perhaps create new openings for advancement in the foreign ministry. So there are a variety of motives. The U.S. had its own problem with these kind of leaks in the past, and we've seen some people do it out of ideological reasons, some people for personal reasons, and so on.
Professor Begg, over to you. It's often said that elections have consequences, and it's especially true when one side claims victory from another. So charting a new course with a new policy direction, that's pretty much normal and typically expected. Yet, what makes this revelation that Mr. Trump may have pulled out of the Iran deal simply out of spite for former President Obama so stunning?
Well, I think we have to put it in perspective. Trump has undone many policies that were very strong for Obama. Think of the Climate Change Accord, the Paris Accord, think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You can see a whole string of things where Trump has said, I want to do the opposite of what Trump has done. It's a bit like in physics, you have matter and antimatter. The US system tends to favor one incoming president from a different party undoing what his predecessor did, and it's always been a he. If you consider what Reagan did after Carter, what George Bush did after Clinton, these are examples of things which have been normal in US politics. Now, where Kim Darroch's telegram to the British government takes it a step further is to imply that it's almost the actions of a 5-year-old wanting to upstage his predecessor in a very petty way. And I think we see an element of that in Trump.
Professor Begg, I want to follow up. So we know that a U.S. president is, of course, expected to act in what he or she believes are in America's best interests. On Iran policy, was Mr. Trump acting in America's best interest? And what about today?
Well, if you believe what the Trump administration says, they think that the Iran deal, in spite of being backed by China and the European powers, was one which was never good because the Iranians were never going to follow it. They also saw Iranian activism in the Middle East, another area where Trump has changed policy from Obama, as being destabilizing in the region, particularly in Syria, but also in the attacks in other parts of the Middle East, in Yemen and in Iraq. So there's a pattern to this of saying, we don't believe the deal is good, we want to undo it. The only way to do it is in Trump's inimical style, to do it very aggressively, and hence the move. Now, that's the Trump view. And then there's the petty view, which says that it was seen as something that Obama had achieved, and undoing it is a way of realizing what Trump wants to do, bearing in mind we're already in the early stages of the next election campaign in the US.
Professor Fan, over to you. President Trump was a leading spokesman for the racist birther movement, and from at least 2010 openly asserted that Obama was both born in Africa and a Muslim, both of which are untrue, of course. He was American-born and as a Christian. So, as one news host described it, from birtherism to the continued trolling of the former president by the current president on Twitter, sort of diminishing the Obama name and presidency has been a foundational goal of this administration. So where do you think, Professor Fan, all of this resentment comes from?
I find it's very interesting. You know, Trump mentioned Obama's name more than 2,700 times. That tells a lot about his emotion to President Obama. Where this resentment comes from? I believe that from the very beginning, his philosophy is very different from President Obama, and that's a reason of that kind of resentment. But it happens that in 2011, you know, there's a White House correspondence dinner, and in that dinner, and President Obama make fun of President Trump, Mr. Trump at the time, for 5 more minutes, and I believe that's the root cause for President Trump try to, you know, hate Obama many times and mention his name very often.
You mean at the National Press Conference, perhaps former President Obama made a few jokes on
yes.
What is now President Trump. Okay. Richard, in what ways has President Trump, you think, tried to undo or even erase Obama's legacy domestically?
Domestically, he's clearly reversed the previous policy of trying to be somewhat moderate on immigration. I mean, the U.S. has many millions of people in the country who live and work improperly, in the sense they don't have correct immigration status. And the administration was looking to amnesty some, particularly children who were brought by their parents, really had no choice in the matter. The current administration is much less tolerant on that regard, more trying to reinforce the border. So it's been most clear in immigration. But Supreme Court picks, I mean, I think President Trump has chosen people who are more traditionally conservative, in favor of limited government, perhaps less open to some kind of civil liberties, more open to gun rights, though. So those are some common areas I think you'd see in people looking at the domestic situation.
And Professor Begg, on the foreign policy side, for foreign observers, this leaked cable frames Trump's foreign policies in sort of a different light. So was the U.S. exit off of the climate change accord also fueled, do you think, by President Trump's resentment towards President Obama? And what about the U.S. policy towards the DPRK, towards Syria or Russia or NATO and so on? Do you see concrete examples where President Trump's personal animus for Obama has influenced U.S. foreign policy?
I think we've got to be a bit careful about trying to attribute everything to personal hostility to Obama. I would nevertheless add a big area in U.S. domestic policy which has not been covered, and that is Trump's attempt to undo Obamacare in health, as well as his changes to the tax code. In international relations, Trump clearly thinks that he can have a solution to the Korea problem, which has, after all, created difficulties for U.S. presidents since the 1950s. He thinks Trump, is the great deal maker who can come out and do this. I think, therefore, in that kind of area, we've moved on from the narrow resentment of Obama to trying to say that Trump wants his place in history by saying he, the deal maker, is somebody who can do more than all previous presidents and not just Obama. You see it a bit with Russia as well. He thinks he can reset relations. He probably regards Putin as being almost a kind of buddy in the way they approach things, in a quite authoritarian approach. So across the board, I would be quite concerned if I were Chinese on this.
And speaking of Chinese, Professor Fan, how has Trump's China policy, you think, shifted from President Obama's stance? I mean, how dramatic is it? And to what degree do you think this shift has been influenced by President Trump's desire to do everything different, even the opposite of how President Obama did it?
I think there are many changes. On the one hand, I believe that the change of the priority. You know, in Obama administration, the top priority is mostly about security issues, South China Sea, Taiwan issue, and East China Sea issues, and also Chinese military modernization. But the trade issue is one of the key issues, but it's a local issue, not very visible. But for President Trump, you know, we can see from last 2.5 years, Trade has topped the agenda for bilateral relationship, and he focused on that, and the security issue become a local issue, and that's a major change of the priority. On the other hand, we can find that the way he handled that issue is very different. For President Obama, he tried to seek cooperation and managed to engage with China to address those disputes and those differences. But for President Trump, he tried to confront China. He tried to use, the tariffs to address those trade disputes. And meantime, the security issue is a local issue, but we can find the consistency between the two administrations.
Richard, if you believe that President Trump's anti-Obama stance remains a prime motivation for this current administration, where do you expect him and his administration to go from here in terms of foreign policy?
I actually don't. I agree with our previous speaker that although there may be some hostility towards Obama's policies, they were seen as too weak and perhaps too liberal. That's not the only, or maybe even the primary factor driving the president. I mean, President Trump has actually expressed a lot of discontent with previous presidents before Obama, the Bush foreign policy, and so on. So where he's going to go, as we know, it's somewhat hard to predict. But I think you probably see a continuation of what we've been seeing now. That is, trying to reach an agreement with Korea, trying to force an agreement with China and Iran, working more on building up conservatives and support in preparation for re-election and so on.
Professor Fan, I want to get your take on this in terms of where you think U.S. foreign policy may go from here, especially as we face an election year in 2020. What might be on the campaign platforms of President Trump?
President Trump, I believe he will continue his current policy agenda, but he will change the way to address those issues. As we can see from the way he handling in response to the Iraq's down the global hawks, the drones, but he cut off the strike, and he meet Chairman Kim in DMZ. It seems to me that he's trying to moderate his moves, and the top priority for the come 1.5 years for him is the election. He wants to get re-elected. That's the first priority for him, and all those his moves and his policy will serve for that goal.
All right, we are going to leave it there. Many thanks for insights on this topic. Thank you to Professor Iain Begg from the London School of Economics and Political Science, as well as Richard Weitz of Wikistrat Global Consultancy, and of course here in Beijing, Professor Jishe of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And that's all for this edition of The Point. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle ThePointWithLX. You can also download the CGTN app to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.